Welcome to another episode of Sagacity. Today we have with us Katrina Lyon, a PhD candidate from Montana State University in the United States. Katrina's PhD is in Microbiology and Cell Biology. Katrina, welcome to Sagacity. Let's start our discussion talking a little bit about what your PhD is in and what the research topic is.
Sure. So at Montana State University, I'm in the Department of Microbiology and Cell Biology. To complicate things more, the label that will be on my diploma is Microbiology and Immunology. However, my project focuses more on kind of like tissue engineering. So specifically, my research for my dissertation is using human organoid models for the gastric mucosal physiological defense. So these are miniature stomachs that you can grow from patient tissue in a lab dish. So you can put the patient in a dish and use those to study how the sticky mucus that lines our stomachs protects us from A, pathogens, and B, stomach acid that comes from ourselves.
What drew you to this area of research?
Well, I did my undergraduate degree at Montana State University as well. So I did 5 years of undergrad and I, did some major changes. Definitely knew I wanted to do something in the biomedical sciences, but I wasn't quite sure. In 2017, I took a class called Human Development and Disease. That was a one-time course, and one of the optional readings for it on the syllabus that no one ever really talked about again was a paper in Nature. It was called Engineering Stem Cell Organoids. And that was the first time I'd ever heard about the fact that you can grow mini organs to a point. Of course, the nomenclature gets much more complicated than that. But you can essentially put the patient in a lab dish to study patient-specific responses to diseases. And in that paper, they were talking about how, cerebral organoids, brain organoids, can be used to study Alzheimer's, autism, Parkinson's disease, etc. And I didn't really do much with that at the time, but then when I got to the point in my undergraduate degree where I was thinking, okay, I need research credit to graduate, I thought I could just take a class for that, and an advisor encouraged me to try and find work in a lab. And I said, well, I don't think any lab will want me. I was a pretty mediocre undergraduate. I was working 2 jobs and, I didn't have the best GPA. But she said, try anyway. And so I remembered actually on my way to that meeting with that advisor, I saw a poster in the hallway that was actually from my current advisor's lab. And it had the word organoid on it. And I was like, oh, interesting. And they were gastric, so little stomachs, right? And so I happened to mention her name, and my undergraduate advisor at the time said to me, oh, I happen to know her. You should send her an email. So I sent her a cold email and we met the next week. This is May 2018 at this point. I met with her, and then I started the next week having no lab experience, and she's still my PI today.
So you went from undergrad to your PhD straight, or finished your undergrad, did some lab work, and then transitioned to PhD?
I jumped right in. So that I did 2 years of undergraduate research at the end of my bachelor's. And so with that same PI, she invited me to stay in her lab for a PhD.
So what is the larger contribution of your research to the society?
So there are a couple things with the research that I do with organoids specifically, like kind of even outside the scope of my own research. There's a great need for patient-specific models for disease. If we both had the same cancer, I might respond differently to a drug than you would. And so as a non-invasive way or minimally invasive way to figure out which drug might be best for me, you could talk about tissue biobanking, and you could grow up my little stomach in a dish, or my pancreas, or my breast, for example. And then you could test a drug on the patient in a dish rather than, in vivo in their body. Of course, that's not a whole multi-organ system as the body is, but, the technology is getting there, and I'd love to talk about that too. But so that's one thing. And then transplantation for organoid technology is also possibly where the field is going. Lots of people die on transplant lists each year. And if there is a way to kind of bioengineer a person's own tissues or regenerate a person's own tissues, like a kidney, for example, in a dish to the point where it could be transplanted back into the patient. Of course, we're quite a ways out from that, I believe, but that might decrease your chances of rejection and save quite a few lives. And then as far as mucus research goes, more specifically, accessibility in mucus research is a huge issue. For example, in my own research, if we were to only study gastric mucus using the real deal, not that what I make myself in the lab isn't the real deal, but we would have to wait for a tissue donation. So that's either a whole organ from someone who has passed away, and then we are in this national like organ donor registry where we can sometimes get that stomach. You don't really hear about stomach transplantation often. And so we would have to wait around for that. Doesn't really come very often, or wait around for a gastric sleeve sample from a weight loss surgery. And so it's all very dependent on, what's going on in someone else's world and can we get that tissue? And that tissue is often very dirty. It can be contaminated with blood, bile, all the gross stuff in our body, that we don't need to do the research. And so if I can grow mini stomachs in a dish, and our lab has been doing this for years and years and years, and even before my time in the lab, we knew that the organoids we were growing had the sticky stuff inside of them. And then we were able to, around the time I started, define that as mucus. We were able to do some immunofluorescent staining, and we could then say, okay, there's mucus inside these little balloons, cellular balloons, if you will. But how do we get it out? And so what I'm able to do is I'm able to open these up, disaggregate these cellular aggregates and grow them flat and have the mucus accumulate on top. It can then be harvested off of the epithelium, the cell layer, and used for experiments. And this mucus, importantly, is clean, and you can produce about as much of it as you could want, depending on, scalability and how many cell cultures you can physically have growing at one time. But this is a way to kind of be able to grow your own mucus, essentially, from any patient you might have tissue for. So this is a way to even maybe see if there are patient differences in mucus samples. Maybe a patient of one demographic might be predisposed to some mucosal deficiency or something like that, or some sort of genetic problem that causes their mucus to slough off more easily, which could predispose them to disease.
Thank you so much for that very detailed explanation of what you're working on. Let's talk a little bit about how you got to doing a PhD in this area. I know you talked a little bit about how you got exposed to this after or during your undergrad. Can you share a little bit about how much qualifications you had for a PhD before you chose this path?
Yeah, so 2 years before I started my PhD, I was doing undergraduate research, and the transition point was around spring 2020 when I was supposed to get my bachelor's. So COVID time, that kind of made things a little strange. But the 2 years leading up to that were a little bit interesting compared to the undergraduate research experiences I'd heard about in the past. So I kind of came into this cold. I had no lab experience, and I just wanted to learn about organoids, and I wanted to culture them. I really thought that the lab position I would be getting would involve just doing dishes for somebody. And I was fine with that. Everyone has to start somewhere. I wasn't really assigned a graduate student like a lot of undergraduates are, like I've gotten myself. I wasn't really assigned a grad student to work under. So I was kind of given my own project by my PI. And so she, sat with me the first day, taught me how to pipette. Even though I learned in classes a million times, and it still just didn't click with me, even something so small, right? And then the next day I was handed a protocol and, still had lots and lots of questions for people who were in and around the lab, because I still had no idea what I was doing. But slowly but surely, I figured it out. And so I learned a variety of techniques like fluorescence microscopy, flow cytometry, culturing various types of cells, dendritic cells, gastric epithelial cells, organoids, and getting to see the graduate students in the lab at the time and what their day-to-day lives were like. I thought it was really fascinating. And I thought, I didn't realize doing a PhD was like this. So it kind of it almost personified the PhD for me, being able to interact with PhD students. And that's what ultimately led to my decision, aside from love for the work as a whole. That's what led to me being able to say, okay, I think I could do this. And it took a while for me to even be able to admit that to myself and then to my PI. But yeah, you have to start somewhere. And my undergraduate research eventually did lead to a publication that was a little bit delayed, I think, due to COVID. It ended up coming out in 2021. It was actually research on gastric organoids still, but I specifically was studying the effects of berry extracts, specifically those from dark berries such as black raspberries, red raspberries, and whether or not they can inhibit bacterial growth inside of these organoids, and whether they have any bactericidal effects. And we found out that they did. There was significant antibacterial activity that these berry extracts had in these organoids. And so this work was published in Antibiotics in 2021. And so that's on the record now. I have a couple more in the works, but from my graduate work specifically. That and some poster presentations as an undergrad. I received the Presidential Emerging Scholars Award from Montana State University in the last semester of undergrad. And that was actually a travel award that was meant to send me to Chicago to present my research at Digestive Disease Week. But COVID, took that out of the running. So still got to put it on the CV, but it'll always have that little COVID asterisk,
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit of a learning curve, I guess, for you, but it worked out well.
Yeah, I definitely had to ask the same question many times, and I still do. I'm still like that. I will say to somebody, I may ask you this again, or give me time to write it down, and I realized that a lot of the protocols that I was given in the lab didn't make sense to me. And so I had to rewrite them in language that did make sense to me. Mm-hmm. And that's what I encourage my students to do now when they join me in the lab. I say, okay, here's my protocol. Rewrite it until you understand it.
That's a wonderful approach, actually. That opens the door to those who are interested in the field, but perhaps may not have that exact expertise in that exact area. Having that flexibility and openness to help them get through the path easily. It's really great. Great that you're doing that too.
Yeah, it's a little ironic. I think I have a bit of an edge as someone who was never innately good at math or science. Growing up, I was terrible at it. I was never told I could be good at it necessarily, and I didn't really care too much until I was a little bit older. And so it never came naturally to me, and that's still the case. I just decided I wanted to be good at it one day and make a career out of it. And so that decision is playing out. But you have to be able to explain things like a human and not like a textbook sometimes.
Of course, and that's also one of the goals of this show, to talk about research that we're doing in universities in lay terms, so everyone can understand it and they can also reach out to people with their interests easily. I wanted to talk a little bit about what the process was like for you when you were applying. It would be helpful if you could talk a little bit about the official things, the applications. Did you have to write any proposals? I know you did enter the program slightly differently because you had a PI who knew your future PI. But what was the process like even then?
So I might actually be helpful here. I did apply to plenty of programs aside from my home institution. And it's kind of a twisty story that just ends up back at the same place, right? But I applied to, I think maybe 8 or 9 PhD programs. Actually, a couple of those were master's programs. I still was thinking, okay, one or the other, I'll still get to the same place. So I kind of started a Google Drive folder, and within that folder, I had a folder for every school I was applying to. And I started a document that listed all of their application requirements, because you will never get away with just a whole one personal statement that you can send to everyone. Because if a school gives you a specific prompt, you better answer that prompt, right? Some schools will ask you for a diversity statement. Some schools will ask you to explain special circumstances that might have interrupted your education. They give you kind of a little chance there to explain anything that might impact your application review. And so I kind of was very organized in that respect. So I wrote my essays for each school, kind of starting off the same template of an essay that I had written. And then I made sure to very carefully modify those and tailor them to the specific school's desires. So there was that. I would say, if I remember correctly, I probably started reaching out to professors at these universities so I wanted to start grad school in fall of 2020. So I started in fall of 2019, reaching out to professors whose labs I was interested in. I picked at least 3 professors from each university, if I remember correctly, to reach out to. And I just sent emails, subject line, student interested in blah, blah program at whatever university, and I got responses from most of them. Actually, I didn't really expect to hear back at all, because they get so many emails like that every day, I'm sure. And you have to make yourself stand out a little bit. And a lot of these were very positive emails. And I had just straight up asked, are you looking for graduate students for fall of 2020? Some of them said yes. Some of them said no. Some of them said maybe. Some of them said, I have a colleague who is. And so really, I was told, the advice I was given was, by the time your application is in and you are writing in your statement statement, I'm interested in working with professors X, Y, and Z, they should have already heard from you. And so that advice really helped me out, I think. And I ended up doing some interviews. But really, the places I got interviews didn't really have the research that I wanted to do. The organoid research wasn't quite as strong or wasn't present at all. And so I had a choice. At the time, the offer I had and the funding my current PI had was for a master's student to do this mucus work in her lab. And so I said, okay, I could go for the higher degree right away and feel like a little bit of a sellout just because I wanted the PhD sooner, but I wouldn't be doing the research that I was interested in. I'm sure I'd come to love whatever I was doing, but it wasn't what I wanted. Or I could get a master's and then go from there and do the research that I want to do. And so I took the master's position. I stayed home, essentially. And after the first year of that program, it came time for my annual committee meeting. And I had mentioned, well, my boss knew that I wanted a PhD. And so we kind of had that conversation. In our department, you can switch from a master's to a PhD if you have your advisor's recommendation and your whole committee approves and the department head approves. And they all agreed I had proven myself worthy of continuing in the PhD program. I could have done my master's and then been admitted into the PhD program that way, but I said, no, I don't want to defend twice. I'm good. So I just switched to the PhD program, and now we're in year 4. So
right, yeah, we call it fast.
I did have to take the GRE now that I think of it.
Before
actually, my home institution. Sorry,
before applying to masters.
Because I guess I was a direct admit at my institution. So it was kind of decided that I would stay at my home institution before I even applied. But then it was like, okay, I have to apply now. And of course, my home institution, after applying to all those other ones, was the only one that still required the GRE. And so I took the GRE, and then a year later, the university says no more GRE. I'm like, shoot. Not that it made much of a difference, but yeah, so the GRE was required. I had letters of reference, but I also had connections at the university as well.
So I actually wanted to ask you a little bit about funding. Did you have funding for all 4 years? Did you have to apply to additional grants, or did you choose to? How was the funding process like for your PhD?
Grad school, I love and have loved because I always said I'm never paying tuition ever again. And so I love that, now I don't have to work and go to school. Going to school is work. So it's not kind of so much of a double life anymore. And so my advisor, especially having her as an undergrad as well, I knew that she was very transparent about the funding situation, which is why she didn't invite me for a PhD, not knowing if she would be able to swing it. And so I knew that she would not ever lead me to believe that there was money when there wasn't. And so I went in knowing that my PhD, or my master's and then my PhD, were fully funded. And so I never had to worry about that. But of course, a little bit extra never hurts. And, another thing on your CV never hurts. And I really wanted practice writing grants because I do want to stay in academia after my PhD. And so I thought, let's just apply for everything and see what happens, which sounds exhausting, but it's such a good experience. So I applied for the NSF GRFP. That's the National Science Foundation's Graduate Research Fellowship Program. I'm glad I remembered all the parts of that acronym after so long. And so that is probably one of the most prestigious fellowships you can get for science in the US. And so you can apply for it as a senior in undergrad, or you can apply for it in your first 2 years of your PhD. And I was in my second year of my PhD, I believe, when I applied for it. So that was kind of my last chance, if you will. Otherwise, you can try again. And so I applied for that, didn't get it, but, the reviewer comments were helpful. And so it was still an exercise. And I still, to this day, go back to the application that I wrote up and the statements that I wrote, and I pull from them because I worked so hard on it. So it's good to have these written materials and save them over time. So if you're ever having writer's block writing a statement later for something like a cover letter, let's say, you can think, I explained this part of my career really well in that one statement. I'm going to go find that and copy and paste it, because you wrote it once and, you did the work. Don't reinvent the wheel. So I applied for that. And then last fall, I applied for the National Institutes of Health F31, which is a predoctoral training award. And so I got to the point where my application was reviewed. I believe only 50% of applications get reviewed. And I got a pretty good score. And the reviewer comments, they seem to like me, but you have to, at that point, get with your advisor and you have a Zoom call with a program officer. And then they will tell you, we think you should resubmit, or we think you should just wait it out and see. And they encouraged me to resubmit just to be safe. But at that point, I'm looking into possibly graduating in the summer of this coming year. And so I was like, maybe I'll just apply for a postdoctoral training grant once I get a job in the next stage, But it was still a really good exercise because you have to write up a whole training plan. Aside from the research you're doing, you have to write up, how you're going to train in, let's say, leadership experience, diversity, equity, and inclusion, all these aspects of your career. They want to know all of it. So that was a really good experience. I was also able to apply for and get another NIH translational health fellowship, and that was from summer 2022 to summer of this year. So just a year-long thing that got me to travel a little bit and kind of learn about the translation of basic research, which is what I do, to translational research, which is the bridge between basic and clinical research. So how do you get your research closer to the clinical world?
Great. Thank you for talking a little bit about grant writing. That is really important if you do want to stay in academia. And like you said, getting that training and practice is wonderful, even with diversity and inclusion and how to train in leadership skills. These things come up when you apply to jobs in academia after the PhD. So great. I wanted to talk a little bit about the structure of your program.
I love talking to people about their programs because everyone's comprehensive exam seems to be a little bit different, even within my own institution. So in my department, you start your PhD and you generally do your coursework the first couple of years. Even in my fourth year, I'm taking a couple of courses because I took some breaks to teach for a little while. But generally, I made a plan to take my hardest courses, what I had heard were the hardest courses in my first year, just to get those out of the way before my research really got rolling. And then from there, continued doing coursework into the second year. And this whole time, I've still been doing research toward my dissertation, because especially having the organoid training already from the same lab in undergrad, I kind of had a bit of a leg up in that respect. I didn't need as much basic training in cell culture. And so I was able to take courses, do my research, and then you're expected to have your committee assembled by the end of, I believe it's your second year. But I already knew some faculty that I wanted on my success team, so to speak. And so I assembled my committee in my first year, and I chose to meet with them, once a year. We also have to give an annual seminar called a Research in Progress seminar. You're exempt if you're a first year doing your exams or defending. But I chose to do one in my first year anyway for the practice. And so that's kind of an opportunity for you to present your progress and then meet with your committee afterwards and then discuss it and see where you're at. And then in your third year, you do your comprehensive exam and your qualifying exam. Our comprehensive exam is a written NIH style, so 6-pager, more or less off-topic proposal. So this is where they want to see if you can write and think like a scientist outside of the subject that you're already naturally passionate about, and that's why you're here, right? And so you can pick something that's almost adjacent. And so I chose to do something along the lines of colonic tumor biofilms, and how drugs permeate the biofilm to reach the tumor. But I incorporated still some methodologies that I thought would be interesting to apply in my research, having read so much into them at this point. So you do that, then you do your qualifying exam, which is no longer an exam in our handbook. It's now more of a committee meeting where you pitch your dissertation proposal. You write it up, similar 6-page-ish format, then you present it essentially. And then you kind of talk with your committee about whether or not you're on track to do that. And then I think on average in our department, it takes 5.5 years to get a degree, a PhD. But, it really varies depending on what the research you're doing is and how much you're able to do in a short amount of time. And so then you defend and then you're on your merry way.
All right. So Katrina, you talked a little bit about what your research is focusing on and how you got through the PhD and about the structure of the program. Let's talk a little bit about your personal experiences. What are some of the difficulties or challenges you encountered since you first considered pursuing a PhD and also during the PhD?
I would say the challenge really started when I knew I wanted to do science as a profession when I was in college. And I was kind of coming off of this, young life of not naturally being good at science. And so I was in classes with these people who sometimes didn't even have to study to get an A on their exams. And I just didn't even understand some of the most basic of concepts, or I felt like I had to work much harder to understand things that came so naturally to my peers. And so it was especially hard working so much as an undergrad to pay the bills. I was the night manager at a grocery store through college. And so that involved, me being in classes sometimes 7, 8 a.m. until about 3 p.m. And then, work usually started 3:30 p.m. or 4 into the evening. There were some nights I was there until 1, 2, 3 in the morning with an exam the next day at 8. It would just start all over again. And it was either, study or sleep sometimes. And I didn't get very much sleep. How I operated with so little, I don't really understand to this day, but that left very little time to go to office hours, for example, build relationships with my professors. So as a student who was kind of like falling behind and just wasn't able to maintain super good grades without the time to really study and nail the material, and just kind of get by, it was really hard. I was like, wow, am I ever going to be able to do something with this? Will this ever end? And that's what made grad school so amazing, because I get to be paid to go to school now, and it's paid for. But at the time, it was really, really difficult. And honestly, the low undergraduate GPA still haunts me to this day. My advisor and I kind of agree sometimes. Even when I got my reviewer comments back from the NIH F31 grant proposal, we were kind of like, wow, reviewer 1 or 2 or whoever it was really still cared about that, because my graduate GPA is very good, and I've gotten great grades. I've had great success, and still the undergraduate grades follow me. I got better throughout undergrad. I was able to kind of adapt a little bit better, but still, if you don't finish with a certain GPA, it can haunt you. But then once I started graduate school, let's see, I wish I could say that I'm out of the worst of the challenges that I faced in grad school. I've kind of had, the last year has really been all adverse life events, seemingly one after the other. I've been dealing with invisible disability this whole time. I had to survive a sexual assault about a year ago. And so that led to a lot of lasting trauma and, now healing as a result. And then had to leave an unhealthy domestic situation at the beginning of this year. So this is all either during or right after my comprehensive and qualifying exams. All of this bad stuff is really going down. And so, of course, it's like at your exams, right? And so these things led to a lot of financial trouble. And of course, as a PhD student, you don't get paid very much. You get paid about enough to live, kind of, which is why it's great to apply for grants and other funding sources so you can maybe supplement that income a little bit and make as much as you possibly can. But then I didn't really have a permanent home for about 3 months this summer, and finally found a place. And now I'm caring for sick parents, both sick in different ways. But I just got back to town a couple days ago, and I'm leaving town again pretty soon. And it's hard to culture cells and do experiments when, it takes so long to get your cells up and growing, but then you have to leave town again to go take care of a surgery or something like that. And so it's just been kind of a pile of things, but really what's gotten me through all of this is a support system that is just incredible. When I started grad school, especially during the pandemic, my cohort became very tight-knit. We kind of got to know each other from 6 feet apart, if you will. And in grad school, in my department, I've just made some excellent friends, 2 of whom actually live in the same apartment complex as me now. And so we really lean on each other during these times, and you kind of have to be that person for someone else, because one day you will need that person to be there for you. And so I've really leaned on them. I've had people taking care of my dog, my cat, and I had a whole team of people from my department help me move at a moment's notice, and so you really never know what role these people are going to play in your life. They're colleagues, they're collaborators, but sometimes they're also good friends. And so that's really helped me through. My university also has a lot of great resources for things like this that might come up in your life. We have a center called the Voice Center, which is for survivors of domestic abuse and sexual assault. And so they've been a great resource to me over the last year or so. There's also an Office of Institutional Equity, which, I used to hear that all the time, but I never really understood what it meant. And when they explained to me that their whole mission is attacking the problem that, some people face barriers to their education that are not fair, that they should not, like if they didn't have this barrier, they would have the same access to an opportunity to their education as everybody else. So it's kind of to help level the playing field a little bit, this office, and they help protect you from discrimination based on any of your protected class identities, such as disability.
Okay. Thank you, Katrina, for sharing the challenges that you went through during the PhD and some of the very personal stories. And I really appreciate you sharing your personal experience, because we don't always get to hear about these experiences as people who are going through PhD programs. What is going on behind all of that work that seems like really important work to the world is not always obvious. So thank you so much for sharing that, and also talking a little bit about how you overcame them and the importance of your support system.
Yeah, to touch on what you just said, whenever I'm on a panel or something for new graduate students coming into the university, and the inevitable question comes up, what do you wish someone had told you when you started? Even though it seems like a given and you should expect it anyway, I wish someone had really drilled it into my head. Going through grad school is already hard, right? But life doesn't wait until you're done with your doctorate to throw things at you. And sometimes it'll be little things, sometimes it'll be big things. But life does not give a crap if you are working on the hardest degree that you could possibly get. No one cares. And so I really, I would tell myself to better prepare for emergency after emergency, because not only are you going through a very difficult degree and having these things thrown at you, but you are not making very much money to recover from those emergencies. And so just preparing in any way you can, just kind of thinking through, I don't know, I don't like to think worst case scenario, but I do. I like to think, okay, if I lost my home tomorrow, where would I go? Who would I ask to stay with? Just things like that. You never know. And at least in Bozeman, Montana, the cost of living has skyrocketed since I started my PhD, and our stipends have not. And so there's only so much you can do to prepare.
That's a very commonly discussed problem. Stipends not increasing, but the cost of living skyrocketing. And also, I think it's very important that we as PhD candidates or PhD students get an opportunity to talk about everything else that's going on, like caring for parents, being an informal caregiver, which actually was the focus of part of my research. People don't really know how much work goes into caring for someone else as an informal caregiver, as a family member or a friend.
You're right, though. People don't talk enough.
No.
If you don't talk to other grad students about the personal things that are going on, then you don't know that other people are dealing with these things too. And also you don't learn how they've dealt with it. Like one thing I wish I had known at the start of my degree, or even before deciding to go to grad school, how many people in grad school, at least that I've met, maybe it's different other places, but a lot of people are kind of in part supported by spouses or family during their PhD. And, I was like, how is everyone living on these stipends and finding these apartments that aren't falling apart? And but yeah, no one talks about that sort of stuff. I didn't know how common it was to have that external support. And so I went into it like, is it just me? Like, am I just financially dumb? No. We just need to talk about things that might be a little taboo sometimes.
I completely agree with you. I know sometimes it is difficult to talk about your own difficulties. I have personal experience with that too during my PhD. It wasn't a piece of cake. I haven't talked about it, but someday I would want to, because it will help other people as well as universities, committees. The more they hear these stories, the more they will be open to listen and ask, and at least have that question of, is there something that's making your journey as a PhD student difficult?
And as you mentor others too, when you have students that you're training, maybe you can see signs that they're going through something, and you can invite them to share as much or as little as they like and offer some advice.
Now, tell me a little bit about your positive PhD experiences so far you've had.
Oh my goodness. I love this question. So grad school, like I have already kind of touched on, you're getting paid to go to school. And so that's the dream. You're getting paid to do what you want. That's amazing. I've had a lot of opportunities to travel. I hate to say it, but this past year, I've almost gotten sick of traveling. I had 3 different conferences or meetings in the spring, and then I went somewhere else in the summer, and I just came back from University of Georgia for another thing, and I've just been all over the place. But it's so fun getting to go to conferences and meet all these people in your field and just share ideas in this really excited way. Just walk around your poster sessions and you see something that catches your eye and you just get to pick their brain. It's so fun. So that's an amazing opportunity. I also love to fly. I think flying is so cool. And so just getting this travel that's usually paid for if you apply for travel awards and such is such an amazing opportunity to get out and see more of the world, I guess. It's been really fun to mature in science as well. And of course, there's always more growing to do, but I get to often reflect back on, where I started, and I can feel and see how my scientific thinking has changed, especially working with the same advisor that I started with in undergrad. The way our relationship works has evolved over time, the way we interact with each other, and it's very pleasant. It's very fun to kind of be able to engage in more scientific discourse with her now than I would have been able to years ago. Let's see, mentoring is also something that I've really, really enjoyed. I've always been one to, ever since I started working as a teenager, I always looked up to my bosses at whatever job I had. I always looked out for good mentorship, bad mentorship. I still remember things that some of my earliest mentors have said to me. And so I've really had a lot of opportunities to train undergraduates in the lab. I think I've had at least 7 or 8 of them at this point, and some of them have stayed for longer, some for shorter periods of time. But that really gives me a chance to be who I would have needed as an undergrad. I really felt like as an undergrad, I fell through the cracks a little bit as a student who didn't have a lot of relationships with faculty and was working all the time, not getting the best grades, and no one seemed to care until one faculty member kind of scooped me up off the ground, I say, and gave me a chance to work in her lab. And that's where I am now. And so I want to be the person who gives someone else that chance who might not otherwise be offered it. Because, a low GPA doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to be a good scientist. What will get you into medical school is not necessarily the same thing that will make you a good researcher. And so that's definitely something to be acknowledged. And so I try to be as human as possible with my mentees and just show them that I make mistakes. Whenever they feel bad about making a mistake, I tell them, oh, one time I did this really dumb thing and it is way worse than what you just did. Believe me. So just being able to share those stories openly and still having that level of respect for each other is so nice. And I like to collect mentors myself. I have faculty that I will go to for advice, and it's nice. It's good to have people in your corner. Don't burn bridges.
That's very admirable. Thank you for keeping humanity in academia. We really need that. I wanted to go back to your research question. You touched on this very briefly before. What are some existing gaps in your area of research? What are some topics that a student might focus on if they choose to do a PhD in the specific area that you're focusing on?
So one thing that is something I wish I could get around to in my PhD, but the way things have gone, I don't think I'll have the time, is I'm currently studying the mucosal defense in our stomach in these mini stomach in a dish models, if you will. But it's important to remember there's also this very dynamic environment in the stomach where our stomach is secreting acid, and that's what makes our stomach acidic so that it can digest our food. And the stomach houses actually one of the steepest proton gradients in the body, from a pH of about 1 to 2 in the middle of the stomach, the lumen, it's called, across the mucus layer to where your cell lining is, and then it's about a neutral pH. And so across just a 200 to 300 micron thick mucus layer, that's a very steep gradient. And so what is it that causes mucus to allow acid to be secreted from the cells up through the mucus layer and then not back diffuse down? And so, what mechanisms of acid transport are out there? That's something that someone could definitely look more into. There are some hypotheses in the field currently that have been explored a little bit for decades. I don't know, often using mathematical modeling, but applying that to a biological model would be an excellent step. Of course, one downside or limitation of organoid technology is, as it stands, we have these little, I'll call them this again, cellular balloons that are full of mucus in my case, right? But there's no input, no output, right? Whereas our actual stomach, we're a tube. Food goes in, food comes out, or whatever it is comes out, right? And so there's no way to get in or out of these things. Yet you can try and port them. A lot of people are starting work with like organs on chips. So you can kind of connect tubing to these things very carefully. Might be easier with one organ model system to another, but just developing a more whole system, maybe even including vasculature, trying to allow blood vessels to grow in and around this mini organ. That will be very big, especially for studies involving the blood-brain barrier, for example. And then, of course, using organoids for transplantation way down the line, even though that's not specifically my line of work, there's a lot that's going to have to be done. You have to co-culture with immune cells. There's this whole dynamic environment in and around every organ. And then, of course, connecting multiple organs to study how like the brain and the heart communicate. And there's just so much you can do. And so that's why we all have to focus very narrowly, right? But those are just a couple of things.
Thank you for sharing some of the current gaps. Now, I have a most frequently asked questions that I would love to hear your opinion on. A lot of people wonder, how do you maintain a balance as a PhD student?
Oh, that question is something I've been asked before, and the answer has really evolved over time. So I used to be the person getting up at 5 a.m., going to the gym, journaling, doing all the things you see online to like have a healthy, happy lifestyle. And it really worked for me for a long time. And then when things kind of started going south in my personal life, and I just found it harder to function on a day-to-day basis, I had to kind of learn to be kind to myself and, let myself sleep until 7, and going to therapy has really helped me maintain a balance. It's something that I'm lucky to have insurance through the university that, helps with the copay at least. I know that there's also like free counseling and psychological services at our university as well that will take you for a shorter period of time. But work in therapy has really helped me to be kinder in that, maybe I shouldn't set goals for myself that I know I can't complete. Like Mondays, I tend to give myself the craziest to-do lists, and then I don't do everything. And then I'm just disappointed in myself going into Tuesday. And so I really learning to not do stuff like that and try to set goals for myself that are achievable has really helped with balance. Also remembering that you're not just a scientist, kind of like we were saying, you're human first, scientist second is what I tell any student of mine. So if you need to go to the emergency room, you need to go to the emergency room. You do need to finish your experiment first. Your cells you can regrow them from a stock. It will be okay. And just let yourself be other people too. Think about who you are. Are you a sister? Are you a friend? Are you a dancer? Are you a musician? Are you an athlete? And keep being those things. Because especially when you're out being those things and people find out that you're a scientist, then that humanizes scientists more. Then someone in your dance class might be like, oh my God, my arm hurts a little bit. Do you know why? And you might not know why, but you can help them figure out how to find out why. And so it's kind of a way to like go out in your community and build relationships as well, just being a whole person. So yeah, that's my take on balance, I suppose.
What is one advice you would like to give future and current PhD students?
Ooh,
I know you've shared such wonderful stories and advice so far. Anything else you would like to add?
Yes. So when I started grad school, I kind of made a promise to myself, and I believe I've kept it. I thought, wow, what an amazing opportunity to get an education that someone else is totally paying for. So I thought, wow, I have to make the absolute most of this. And also having an advisor who really took a chance on me and saw potential in me, I thought, wow, I really need to make her proud as well. And so I would encourage everybody to just make the absolute most out of it, which sounds like very generic advice, but I'll explain. What I mean by that is if there's something you think could be better about your program, change it. seriously get into any leadership position that might be relevant and change it. I took on any leadership position that was available to me in my first 2 years of graduate school. I served as the graduate student representative for my department. I was on, and still am on, multiple committees. Just make the change that you want to see in graduate school be, more tolerable for the people who come after you. You can create institutional change at this career level, whether people tell you you can or cannot. You really are in charge of it. I was originally going to label this advice as be annoying. Also, you have to ask for things. My mom always said, if you don't ask, you don't get, which is very true. If you want someone to be on your committee, if you want to go learn this technique in someone's lab, they're not just going to read your mind and email you out of the blue and offer it to you. You have to ask. If you want to take a class that is not in the listed curriculum for your department, but you think it would benefit your research, ask your department head. And if they aren't the right person to ask who you ask. You just have to go for things and be a little bit fearless. So
I don't even know what to say to that, because it's hard to find people who want to make the change they want to see in whatever the society or system or in the world at large. So I'm really glad to have come across you. I think the same, because my dad used to say that and do that. He used to work very hard to make changes, systemic changes. And I believe in that. I know it's a lot of hard work. You said ask. If you don't know the person to ask about the person to ask. It's a lot of work. But if you don't do it, then who's going to do it, right?
Exactly. And disclaimer, it will lead to burnout at some point if you aren't careful. That's where the balance comes in, right? I have recently, dropped a couple of the positions because I was like, you know what? Someone else is well equipped to take this on. It doesn't need to be me forever. Because if you can't take care of yourself, what is the saying? Put on your own oxygen mask first, right?
It doesn't have to be that you take on all the problems. If you can focus on at least one change, that still counts. And that's what I've always That's what I always say and will continue to say. And another really important thing you said was some of the changes that you can make at this level, it still counts, because this kind of practice of wanting a change and working to make a change, it follows with you wherever you go. So when you're at a higher level, wherever that is, at a decision-making level, these kind of practices and values are the things that are going to make bigger changes in the society. So I'm really glad to see that this is what you believe and practice. Anything else you would like to share with the audience? It's my last question for you.
Oh, goodness. I think I'm out of things, believe it or not.
It was a wonderful conversation. You shared so much with me and our audience, and I'm really grateful for that. Thank you so much once again, Katrina, for taking the time off of your busy schedule. It's quite late in Montana, but still you agreed to do this interview with me.
Thank you.
And our audience, thank you for being here with us today. Until next time, bye everyone.